You're listening to episode 53 of the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast. Today's episode is going to be a look at a paper which is called Personal Construct Psychology Model of School Counselling Delivery. I know that quite a few listeners are either educational psychologists or work in schools in some other capacity, and I thought it might be quite helpful to have a look at the PCP model. At present, most schools who are involved in the mental health support team programme will be using a CBT model as their dominant model, and that will remain the same for the future waves, which means that 100% of schools will have those support services in them. However, CBT is quite tricky for some students, and there needs to be an alternative model, and there are a number of models you could use, but I'm going to talk to you about a paper describing a PCP model. So this paper is called Personal Construct Psychology Model of School Counselling Delivery, and it's by Deborah Truneckova and Linda Viney. Now, they worked in Australia, which seemed to be quite advanced compared with the UK in trying to bring together models of counselling that could be used in schools. We've caught up since then in the UK, which I'm glad to say, and now we need things that offer an alternative to the CBT for those young people who don't really respond in the ways that you might need them to in CBT. So this paper, although it was written in 2012, is very currently interesting, at least to me. There's a very strong argument for delivering any kind of service to children in schools which supports their mental health. Having worked for many years in the NHS, I would say one of the major things is actually the difference in time taken. So in order for a student to come out of class to attend a therapy or counselling session, you're looking at just the time of the session. If they have to come to a clinic, you're going to probably end up with half a day's schooling lost. And for some young people, they find it very difficult to go into school at an alternative time, so they might have the whole day off. And if you've got a series of sessions, that's a significant loss of education. And of course, it's not just the education, it's the relationships. It's also explaining to friends or teachers why you're absent from certain lessons, and that can be quite tricky for students. So the more we help them in the setting they're already in, the better for them. Truneckova and Viney's model is suitable for all ages, so they said from 4 to 18. And because it's not determining a protocol, which is very different from following a CBT protocol, it needs a theory and a philosophy which stands behind it to enable it to stand up on its own 2 feet and to be reliably delivered. They remind us there already is evidence for using PCP in sessions in schools, although the majority of that data is related to group work. And what they were anticipating is that this model would be delivered through other people working in schools rather than themselves. So school counsellors in the Australian system, in the UK that might be the mental health support team or counsellors. Or it could be in some services educational psychologists as well. Or of course any kind of mental health professional who works primarily in schools. And I'm using schools here to say schools and colleges. So the principles of the model are set out in a series of 4 propositions, and the processes are described through strategies that relate to those propositions. These strategies are for the counsellor rather than the young person. So let's have a look at the propositions first. So we'll take all 4 and then we'll go into more detail for each one. Firstly, there are always alternative ways of looking at any event. Secondly, experiences are tested out through behaviour, and behaviour becomes the principal instrument of inquiry. Thirdly, psychological disorder occurs when there is consistent invalidation along with the exclusive use of particular construing strategies. And then fourthly, professional constructs, which are verbal and non-verbal construing, core and peripheral construing, emotions as experiential transitional states, and cycles of experience, creativity and decision making. Now, going back to the proposition 1, there are alternative ways of looking at any event. They say the first proposition involves the school counsellor approaching each event or context with the assumption that no one has direct access to the truth. There are potentially alternative ways of making sense of each other, ourselves and our worlds. There is an implicit understanding that young people will differ in their constructions of events and experiences. The school counsellor views the behaviour of the young person as attempts to work things out, to know. This is very helpful in terms of thinking about children and young people who might display what the adults find as very difficult behaviour. So if we're focused on what the meaning is of that, it may lead us to very different strategies than if we only focus on whether or not it occurs, how many times it occurs, or where it occurs. So understanding how it occurs, which is what sense it makes to that young person and how it fits with them as a person, is what we're really getting at here. The second proposition is that experiences are tested out through behaviour, which is the principal instrument of inquiry. And they say, the second proposition in this model asserts that the testing out of experiences takes place through behaviour, and for the school counsellor, behaviour becomes the principal instrument of inquiry. Through behaviours, the young person poses questions and compares their own meanings with those of others. For the school counsellor, a young person's behaviour is experimental rather than reactive, and behavioural choices reveal much about the construing of self. The school counsellor is asking, what is the young person not doing by doing what she is doing? And to me, this goes back to Kelly's idea of being curious about our clients, that we're really looking at that and thinking, why does it make sense to a student to throw something across a classroom when the outcome of that is going to be that they get into trouble? What is it that's going on there? And to be curious about that means that we don't have to worry about whether the behaviour was right or wrong. We're trying to understand. And we don't just want a surface understanding, which is, they annoyed me or they tried to bully me. You want to know, okay, so what exactly happened and what was going on there, and what did you make of what was happening? And is your response because you feel that's the best way to deal with it, or are you feeling, you maybe could have done things differently and that could have worked out differently? Why take that reaction? And what sense do you make of what happens as a result of it? So it's very much thinking, okay, so what's going on with that behaviour, but what underlies it? And all of PCP is about that. We're focused on the meanings that people make of their lives and their experiences. And they draw our attention at the end of that proposition to remembering to think about what someone's not doing by doing the thing they're doing. What would it mean if somebody insulted you and you didn't throw something at them? What would the implication of that be for you as a person? Would it mean that people might start to see you as weak or as shy or as compliant? Is it that you're trying to be assertive in your response, but maybe the response has become too big? So thinking about why it makes sense to do it involves thinking about why anything else isn't better. Proposition 3, psychological disorder occurs where there is a consistent invalidation, along with the exclusive use of particular construing approaches. And they remind us that Kelly's definition of disorder is rather different. So, according to Kelly, the young person exhibits a psychological disorder when faced with consistent invalidation of their constructions and, with no alternative constructions available, believes there are no other choices of behaving. They say that this definition was later broadened by Kelly, indicating that a psychological disorder can include any structure that fails to accomplish its purpose. The school counsellor understands the psychological disorder/problem of a young person as a result of thinking and feeling that they have no alternative options. The psychological problem produces a repeating pattern of troublesome behaviour. Then the fourth proposition is professional constructs. The fourth proposition in this model of school counselling concerns the ways in which the school counsellor sets out to understand the young person and how the school counsellor uses professional constructs to assist in organising their understanding of the personal constructs of the young person. For the school counsellor, these professional constructs assist the school counsellor to guide the young person to develop more open rather than constricted construct systems. So this is about the construing of the counsellor and using the model of PCP to help them to understand that young person. They draw our attention to 4 areas which they take in turn. The first is verbal and non-verbal construing. They remind us that we all have both verbal and non-verbal constructs, and we also have pre-verbal constructs. So just a reminder, a non-verbal construct is something that you haven't yet needed or you don't turn into words. So if you imagine construing a colour, it's very hard to turn that into a group of words that make a lot of sense, but we can do that visually. So if you said, what kind of blue is this? You'd be able to answer that question roughly, but you would have to make quite an effort to do so. So our non-verbal construing we're using to construe our senses and the sensations of being alive and moving around and sitting and standing and eating and drinking and all of those things, or being hot, all those proprioception things as well. Our pre-verbal constructs are the constructs that were developed before we needed any words. Our pre-verbal constructs are the constructs we developed before we had words for those things. And one of the most important ones is love. It's a long time before we start to move into being able to define what that means and understand there are different kinds of love for different things and different people. But sometimes our pre-verbal construing lingers longer than we might like. So we find ourselves responding in ways that aren't particularly helpful for the current situation, but might relate to some early experiences that we have. And remember, this section is about the professional constructs. So they say the professional construct implies that the school counsellor will not only attempt to construe the young person verbally and non-verbally, but will employ both verbal and non-verbal techniques and strategies to facilitate the expression of thoughts and feelings. This reminds us that we need a range of alternative ways of eliciting construing. We can't just rely on talking. So drawing is a common, popular way of helping young people to express their views, but that's not the only way. You could use drama, you could use art, you could use music. So all those alternative ways of relating to people in psychotherapeutic experiences are really useful here. The aim is the same. Can I understand you better at the end of using this way of helping you to show your construing? The other thing, of course, is that in any session you'd be watching out for the non-verbal construing that is telling you something more than the words. So if the young person remains slouched in the chair for the first half of the session, that's telling you something extra, although they might be saying, I want to get out of this situation that I'm in. I don't like what's happening and I'm really determined. You've got 2 lots of construing to consider there. You've got what's coming out of their mouth and the way their body is telling you something different. And that's, again, for a curious question. I would say to a young person, that's interesting you're saying that, because I wouldn't have guessed, if I'd seen a video of you and there was no sound on it, I wouldn't have guessed you were saying that. I'm just wondering, is there a part of you that is really not wanting to change, and maybe you're thinking you need to say that you do in order to have a conversation with me. And I would also say, most people don't want to change very much. We're surrounded by a world that actually encourages change and, asks us all the time to be different in some way, whether that's something to do with ourselves or house or car. We're surrounded by change and encouraged to feel that, the next change is going to make everything so much better. And sometimes we need to remind young people that they don't necessarily want to change, and we understand that, and that actually that's normal. People don't go around normally saying, I'm going to be really different. Mostly we get on with our lives and we do what we've done before. And the reason for that is that change is pretty difficult to do, or at least to do it and sustain it, because it's not going to be sustained unless that change is related to a different way of seeing a self or the world. The second professional construct they refer to is core and peripheral construing. And they say core constructs are those constructs by which the individual maintains their identity, their maintenance processes, while peripheral constructs are those that can be altered without serious modification of core structure. Kelly, 1955. They remind us that most psychological therapies will have a version of core constructs. These are essential for understanding what makes a person tick, why they choose to do what they do, and why they choose not to do certain things. They remind us core constructs are harder to change as they are the means by which young people understand themselves and their self-identity. And we've had lots of episodes already on core construing. I would encourage you to go back and listen to those if you're not familiar with it. The third professional construct is emotions are experiential transitional states. They say that Kelly integrated emotional experiences within his theory, seeing personal construct theory as no more a cognitive theory than it is an affective or conative one. So they say emotional experiences are part of the young person's construction of experience. As young people are construing, they are experiencing and feeling. They point out that the 4 transitional states which are important in clinical work are anxiety, guilt, threat and hostility, and we have other episodes already on those, so please go and look them up. They say that anxiety can be seen by the school counsellor as a precondition for change, a trigger for the young person to make revisions in their construction system. The school counsellor understands that guilt is experienced when young people behave in a way that they believe is not like them, not how they construe their character. Threat occurs when the young person foresees that events confronting them are going to result in considerable change to their core constructs. Hostility by the young person is the continued effort to extort validational evidence in favour of a type of prediction which has already proved itself a failure. Instead of revising the construction that has been invalidated, the hostile young person extorts evidence that they were right all along. The school counsellor views the behaviour of the hostile young person as acts whereby they are trying to alter events to make them conform to their own original expectations. These transitional constructs are crucial to understanding the theory of PCP, and I really would suggest you go back and listen to other episodes which cover those. Then the 4th professional construct, cycles of experience, creativity and decision making. All of these are about therapeutic change. Within this professional construct, they draw attention to 3 cycles which are central to the process of therapeutic change: the experience, the creativity and the decision making. And they say while these cycles overlap to some extent, there are fundamental differences between them. And I will read what they said because I think these are helpful summaries of these cycles. The experience cycle, which has 5 phases, begins with the phase of anticipation where the young person looks forward to what is to come. The second phase consists of a commitment or self-involvement by the young person. The young person is now open to experimenting with a new event or experience. The next phase comes when the young person encounters the new event and the experience is fully construed, bringing either confirmation or disconfirmation of the expected outcome. In the light of this, the young person will revise their understanding of themselves and the world. In this final stage of constructive revision, the young person's anticipations may be largely confirmed, or it may be that the young person will need to take a fresh look at their long-held views of themselves. The second change is the creativity cycle. This initiates the process of change through the back and forth movement from tight to loose construing. The young person is encouraged to consider different ideas or options to loosen up their construing. Once this has taken place, the young person is assisted in narrowing down their options to choose which revision in meaning they wish to adopt to tighten their construing so that decisions can be made. The third change cycle, the cycle of decision making, involves circumspection, preemption and choice, known as the CPC cycle. The cycle begins with circumspection, where the young person looks at all the issues entailed in decision making. Preemption occurs when the young person begins to order the importance of the issues. This is followed by choice, when the young person decides on the action to be undertaken. It is proposed that the school counsellor uses these cycles of experience, of creativity and of decision making to encourage the young person to firstly entertain the notion of change and then to take part in the process, allowing change to happen. So now we have a model of personal construct psychology counselling that can be delivered in schools, and they go on to talk about the strategies that you would use. They say this personal construct approach to school counselling is designed around the problem of reconstruing life, but it is not a system built on psychopathology. Kelly, 1955. Working within such an approach requires the school counsellor to assume responsibilities for the welfare of the young person, as well as understanding of the reflexive nature of the theory. This means, as the young person changes their construing of events, the school counsellor will be changing as well. The school counsellor encourages the notion that the young person has the right to be heard and that their meanings are to be revered. The relationship between the young person and the school counsellor is central to the personal construct approach. The counselling connection will then be developed by the school counsellor into a role relationship, the cornerstone of personal construct psychology counselling. In personal construct counselling, a role relationship exists wherever a person attempts to construe the construction processes of another person, a process of actively trying to understand the other person. It is a relationship where emotional closeness is balanced with mutual respect for the role and selves of both people. Within this relationship, a counsellor balances roles of following and working alongside the young person while also guiding or leading them through the change process. And then remind us that the young person is always remaining the author of the reconstructions. Personally, I've found this is really helpful for working with young people whose experience has been that people tell them what to do all the time. So giving them the chance to say things from their own point of view, to understand the world, to explain it, is very empowering for them. They list 4 strategies for doing this. The first is the school counsellor adopts a credulous approach, which they describe as an attitude of seeing the world through the eyes of the young person. The school counsellor makes no assumptions about what the young person means. This means we need lots of ways to ask further questions and to be able to understand what the young person means asking those and understanding the answers and double checking and finding the contrast poles so that you can understand where a child is coming from in the way that they're seeing the world. The second strategy is the school counsellor adopts a role of inquirer rather than expert and promotes hypothetical and provisional ways of thinking. This means asking questions and inquiring to learn more. This approach is openly conveyed to the young person, and they are encouraged to adopt a similar way of thinking. They say the school counsellor, as the inquirer, also adopts the role of catalyst, encouraging reactions in the young person without imposing any from themselves. They talk here about the importance of understanding the child's meaning and their construing that lies behind whatever their responses are to situations. That also relies on being able to draw out the ways in which you can validate the young person so that the experience doesn't invalidate them. The third strategy is the transitive diagnosis generates treatment implications for the school counsellor. They say, with transitive diagnosis, the school counsellor endeavours to capture an understanding of the person's experience, reality, and construing or meaning-making processes. Such an approach allows the school counsellor to conceptualise psychological disorder not as who needs treatment, but what needs treatment. Kelly, 1955. And here we can use other kinds of psychological models of therapy to help young people to revise their construing. The important thing here is that although you might use something drawn from another therapy or another sort of paradigm to do with diagnosis, like a checklist or something, you'll be using it with a completely different intention. So you might choose something because somebody needs a really tight structure and they want to understand a diagnosis they've been given and think how that plays out for them. If you want to talk to them about that, then understanding what the diagnosis means and being able to construe it in a different way might be really, really helpful. For instance, the diagnosis of autism, which in previous ages has been experienced by people as an entirely limiting diagnosis, which at the time I first came into the world of autism implied special school and a lifetime without work. We know that isn't the case at all, but we do know that some people will follow that path because they have severe difficulties with learning, but it's their difficulties with learning, not their autism on its own, that will cause those range of problems, which means they might need a lifetime of support. For the other people, it's about understanding how they can use their autism in their life in a helpful way. So if they're a collector of something, can you expand that collection so eventually you've got an eye for what kind of job that could lead into. If you're a collector, you've got skills that are really useful for lots and lots of different roles in life. The other thing they say, of course, is that you can use any personal construct psychology technique here to help you to understand that young person. If you want some free techniques, there's some on my website. Here I would really suggest that you have a look at the PCP Pocketbook, because that includes all the techniques that we could find at the time of writing. There may be more now, and summarises them all and explains where you can find out more about them. That book is super cheap, like all our Coventry Constructivist Centre books. The fourth and final strategy here is that the school counsellor guides the young person to reconstruction by disconfirming their unhelpful constructions while validating their self and their construing/meaning making. They say that although the young person's personal interpretations are honoured, they are also challenged by the school counsellor. In the personal construct model of counselling, invalidation becomes the key to reconstruction. As the young person struggles with a difficult problem and experiments with new meanings and behaviours, there is a moment when they suddenly seem to get it. They talk about trying that out in the real world and the fact that there will be failures, and that's inevitable within this process. So the way somebody construes and anticipates might not work at all. So you might have an experience such as a young person decides they're going to behave really well in the maths class, and that's going to lead to a different relationship with the teacher. So they try behaving really well in the maths class, and the maths teacher is sarcastic to them about that. That doesn't lead to a very helpful reconstruction. So that young person comes back to the counsellor and talks about it, and they think about, okay, so what was going on there that maybe the teacher couldn't anticipate this change in you and perhaps was hostile towards you in the PCP sense, because they're treating you as in the way that fitted with their previous construing. They don't know that you're trying out changes. They remind us that these unsuccessful outcomes are going to happen and that they are essential to being able to refine that construing. So those new constructs need attention, and trying them out and seeing how well they work is an essential part of the process. It's also the way we do things in life, so it's not an unfamiliar process to us. They remind us that change cannot be achieved in a straightforward, linear manner, but is full of attempts that don't work out. So this goes back to the person as scientist, conducting experiments with their behaviour to see how that changes their worldview, or their view of themselves. The role is really important here for the counsellor. So they say, this is when the school counsellor provides validation for the young person's self-identity and their ability to have a go, while continuing to invalidate their problematic meanings which led the young person into difficult waters. And as a counsellor or therapist, this can be quite painful, that the person you're working with goes out and tries things and comes back reporting none of it worked. That doesn't mean that it won't work in the future, but it means that the counsellor's role is to help the person to find ways to reconstrue that without reconstruing themselves in a way that doesn't make any sense to them or invalidates their sense of self. I think this is where the counsellor or therapist, there's quite an art to this work, that is about a little dance of therapy, of how you do that and what you're watching as your young person is responding to those experiences, and the fact that you can't deny to them it didn't work out. So it can be a relatively uncomfortable thing, but actually is part of real life, being able to experiment, take results that don't come out the way we expect, revise our construing. In their conclusion, they say, as personal construct psychology is essentially an ideographic approach, our model is well positioned to understand the diversity of needs of students and schools. The model sets out to address this function by developing a method of practice through a set of principles, processes, and interpersonal relationships. They go on to say, it is a counselling approach that focuses on the positive indicators rather than the deficit indicators of psychological well-being. The school counsellor builds on the skills and capacities of the young person, rather than focusing on correcting problematic behaviours. Working within this model, the school counsellor sets out to build up the ability of the young person to cope with stressors and to develop autonomy and trust, constructions of self-other, including self-esteem and identity, empathy, and positive social relationships, all indicators of positive well-being. So, if we think about that, what they're providing is a model of PCP counselling that could be delivered in a school with an idea of what you'd need to train the counsellors to be able to do and how you might do that in a real live session. And in the paper they give some case examples too, so it's worth reading if you can get a hold of it. You'll get it through a library, but otherwise you've got to pay for that paper, unfortunately. I'll put the reference in the show notes and you can see if you can get a hold of it. Okay, I think that's all for today, and I will see you again at the end of next month. Thanks for listening. Bye.